What's going on, everybody? Ab the Audicrat here, and today we're going to be doing another beat breakdown in my beat breakdown series. This is episode 3, and we'll be going over the Producers podcast theme. A few years ago, Crazy Drazy from Das EFX, the legendary rap group, hit me up, and he happened to use this on his podcast, the Producers podcast theme, as the title track. I was super amped when he told me this. I've been a Das EFX fan since way back. When I originally made this beat, I did think it would sound good on a podcast or a commercial or something like that. Just has old school vibes. Pretty straightforward, good bass line, hard-hitting drums, the whole nine. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing, liking the video, dropping a comment. Helps me out quite a bit. I'll be dropping a lot of these beat breakdown videos in the future, as well as plugin videos, Pro Tools videos, more Reason videos. Stay tuned, and let's get right into this one. Let's listen to the beat real quick. Now that's the bulk of what goes on in this beat. It's only 1 minute and 20 seconds long. There is a break in the middle of the song with a crash. Let's go over each individual sound. It's pretty much drum, sample, bass, and let's just solo the drums. And it does a few more things. That's pretty much it, though. Once Reason Studios dropped Mimic a few years ago, I just completely switched over that for drum programming and for samples, and sometimes for my bass if I'm using a bass sample. The redrum is still dope, but there's some limitations that to some might be really good. I just prefer Mimic. It has a few more capabilities that I can't live without now. So we got a kick, snare, hi-hat loop. Didn't use that snare. And then a clap. This is also something I don't do anymore. I don't have spaces in between my sounds and whatever device I'm using. Right before Mimic dropped, I had a very specific template that I used for all my beats, and I was still using these parametric EQs that Reason made on all my drum sounds. I don't use them anymore. I'm just using F6 for the most part. I'll throw a Pultec in there and maybe a custom series from Slate, but I don't really use these anymore. I always had a delay line on this too in case I wanted to do I think it's called the Haas effect, where, you just pan it hard one way and then delay it to the left and it gives it a stereo effect. There's many other ways I can do that now, specifically with Isotope's Imager, but this way is still a pretty cool way to add some stereo imaging to a sound without actually having an imager. For the drum processing on this, all I put on was Knock by Decap. I got a little bit of punch, a little bit of saturation, a little bit of vintage air, and then a little bit of hard clipping, and I always have this about 15, 20%, probably more like 15 on the dry wet knob. Just gives it a little something, pushes it right over the edge. And let's play the sample in solo real quick. Big shout out to my man PJ Katz over at Mordella Music Library. He produced this sample along with Dustin DeLuke, who's a keyboard player. Love all of his stuff in the Mordella Music Library. If you have not checked that out yet, go check it out. So one of the first things that I'm hearing when I solo the sample, there's two things. There's a lot of clicks when the samples are hitting, and the samples have some gaps in between the end of one and the start of another. Now, sometimes that can be okay, but in this case, I don't really like it that much. When I was making the beat, clearly I didn't really care, or I didn't notice it that much. And when everything is playing in a beat and it just sounds good already, sometimes it's not worth it to go back and make all these tiny changes. The imperfections can sound not only just fine, but can even enhance at times. If I went back to when I made this beat, I would have bounced this to audio, fixed the timing of everything. Well, even before I did that, I would go to the Dr. Octo Rex, which I loaded all my samples into right up until Mimic dropped. I would chop them all up in Recycle. You just raise the attack right here, and it just kind of gives it a quick fade on every time a sample triggers, so there's a little bit of a fade in the beginning. I did have it up a little bit, but clearly it wasn't enough to get rid of the clicks. That's something you can also fix if you bounce to audio. You can just put a fade at the beginning and the end of each chop. The Dr. Octo Rex is something I use for many, many years before Mimic dropped. I always had a few devices because if I was chopping up a sample that was very long and it had more than, I believe, 92 chops, you couldn't load one whole Recycle file with that many chops. So you had to bounce out multiple Rex files. And what I did is I would load each one into different Dr. Octo Rex devices. If you're familiar with Dr. Octo Rex, you can load 8 different samples in one device, but the way you switch from one or the other is not something I was a big fan of, at least in the way that I normally sample. For the processing on the sample, I had it running through a Pwig Child from Waves. It is a Fairchild emulation, which sounds really good, really smooth. High shelf boosted at about 2.5K, pretty wide Q. And then I have it going through an F6, high pass, low pass, and then a little bit of a dip at 3K. And now let's go over the bass from the beginning real quick. that's pretty much it for the bass. It just loops. Some of the parts I take out here and there. You could probably hear the fuzz and the punch in that. I did throw Slate's virtual tape machines on this and cranked it up quite a bit. And then we have Track Spacer, which I use for side chaining all the time. Side chain my kick to the bass. It's also not a bad idea to side chain your snare to the bass if the snare is really snapping or hitting pretty hard. Sometimes I'll stack one for the kick, one for the snare. Sounds real dope. For the sound itself, I use the Subtractor and the Wonder bass setting. I've used this on many songs. Love the way this sounds. In recent years, I've really tried to expand the bass sounds I'm using. For the longest time, this was one of my go-to bass sounds. Still is in a pinch. All right, we're about to wrap it up here, but I want to go over the mix bus really quick with you. I have everything going through a virtual mix rack. Got a little bit of shimmer on Revival here. I also boosted a little bit of 4K, which is unusual for me. I'm usually taking that back a little bit on the mix bus, and I gave it a little bit of 10K to add some air. Then I ran it through the virtual bus compressors from Slate Digital. This adds a lot of sound, a lot of character to it, even without the compressors running. Even if you just put this on the track, it really adds some saturation. When I'm using this, I don't do a lot of gain reduction, a little bit from each compressor. Sometimes I might only use 2 of them, sometimes only 1, but if that's the case, I'm really just using the single unit. But again, really dope for a mix bus, gives it a lot of cool sound. Again, great saturation. Always good to be aware of the noise that this plugin gives you on top of other analog model plugins. You might want to dial back the mix knob on this, especially if the whole signal's going through it. It can pull back a lot of that noise if it's just going a little bit overboard. Keep that in mind. Next up is Waves J37, a tape emulation plugin. When I went back to mix this for the single, I did have to throw the MOTT on this, MOTT. I never know how you say it. It is just such a dope unit to really glue your mix together, give it some punch without it being too snappy. Pulled back the dry wet to 66. I usually pull back the high amount too, which is just the higher end of the frequency range. Sometimes I pull it back as far as 30 or 40, but I got it just over 60 on this one. And that pretty much does it for this one, the Producers Podcast theme, episode 3 of my beat breakdown series. Again, super amped that this got to the Producers Podcast hosted by Crazy Drazy of Das Effects. If you haven't checked that out, it's a must watch. He has some dope guests on there. Easy LP, Ninth Wonder, Havoc, many more. Check it out if you haven't yet. Thank you so much for stopping by. We're going to end it with the full beat. Peace.